Welcome to part 2 of my Geometry Nodes Blender tutorial series for beginners. So if you haven't seen part 1, then definitely check that out. I'll have a link to the tutorial playlist in the description. So in the first part, I went over the very basics of Geometry Nodes. So I showed you how to get to the Geometry Node editor. I explained how Geometry Nodes is a modifier that you can add to different objects, and I went over some other shortcut keys. So in this part, I'm going to show you how to add a curve object, and then we're going to use Geometry Nodes to add thickness to the curve. And then we're going to be creating some leaf objects, and I'll show you how to add the leaf objects to the curve to make the stem of the flower. Before we start, I wanted to let you know about Blender Grid, which is an amazing render farm service for rendering your Blender projects. Blender Grid is an easy to use render farm specifically designed for Blender. I've used the service and I highly recommend it. Upload your Blender file or a zip file with the blend file and textures. You can change the render settings on the website before rendering. Blender Grid will let you know the cost before you start the render. You can even choose when you want the render to finish if you're on a tight deadline. While it renders, you can check the rendered frames to make sure everything is rendering properly. Once it finishes, just download the files and compile the frames in a video editor. Use the link in the description to get $20 of render credit on your first render. Alright, so here we are in a new scene in Blender, and we're first going to start by modeling the leaf object. So we're not going to get into geometry nodes quite yet, but we will later in this video. So to model the leaf, I first just want to delete everything, so I'll select everything with the A key, and then we'll hit the X key, and we'll just click on delete. So I'll now go to the add menu by pressing Shift A. Let's go down here to mesh, and I'm going to add a plane for the leaf. And then I can zoom into the leaf, and then I will hit the tab key to go into edit mode so we can edit the leaf. So I want to scale the leaf down so it's thinner, so I'll hit S to scale. We can then hit X to scale on the X-axis, and let's make that quite a bit smaller. So I now want to add a loop cut in the center. So to add a loop cut, I will press Ctrl R, and then I can left click and then right click so that the loop stays in the center. So I now want to add the subdivision surface modifier to the leaf to smooth it out. So let's go here to the modifier properties, and I'll click on add modifier. We can go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the subdivision surface, and you can see it's smoothing out those edges. And let's turn the levels viewport to 2 and then also the render to 2. So I now want to make the top and the bottom smaller, but then on the inside here, it's going to be a little bit bigger. So I'll press Ctrl R to add a loop cut here, and I will left click and then right click so the loop cut stays in the center there. And then I will hit S to scale, and we'll scale it up on the X axis and place it there. So now what I can do is click and drag to box select these nodes, and I can scale these nodes down, and we'll just scale that down so it's a bit smaller like that. And then I can select this vertex and shift select this vertex, and I'll press G to grab, and we want to move it back, and we'll hit Y to bring it over on the Y axis and bring that back, and then I'll hit S to scale, and we'll scale that up a bit. And then if I select the entire thing with the A key, I think I want to scale the entire thing down a bit on the X axis a little bit more. And maybe select these two vertices, so hold down the Shift key, select both of them, and scale them up just a little bit. And then I'm going to select this one, shift select these two other vertices, so we have these three selected. And let me just go to top view by hitting the 7 on the numpad, and then I'll hit G to grab, and then I can click with my mouse wheel to constrain it to the Y axis and bring that back a bit, and then I can scale it down on the X axis. Then I'll hit E to extrude. We want to extrude it out on the Y axis, so hit Y, and then I can scale the entire thing down just like that, so you can see we're kind of getting the shape of the leaf, and then extrude this out one more time, bring it out on the Y-axis to just kind of make that little stem there. All right, now you can see right here it is very round, and so I want to make it sharper there. So to do this, I'll press Ctrl R to add a loop cut. I can left click, drag over, drag it pretty close, and left click again, and then Ctrl R to add another loop cut, left click, drag over, and left click again. And then you can see right here it's like really close to each other. So let's just click and drag to box select just these parts right here, and I will scale them out a bit. Let's scale it on the X-axis and just make that a little bit bigger so there's a bit more space. Now you can see right here, because we added the subdivision surface, it's kind of rounding here and rounding here. So I'm going to press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and I will left click, drag over, and left click there to kind of sharpen up that edge. And then right here, Ctrl R, let's click, drag this over and click there to kind of sharpen up that edge. All right, so I'll zoom out there, and if I hit the tab key to go back to object node, you can see that's looking much more like a leaf. And let's save this project. So to save the file, we can click right up here on File, and then I'll click on Save As. So I'm going to rename this to geometry nodes flower.blend right here on the name, and I'll save it in the product files, so with the other tutorial files, and then I will click on save blender file. And then as you're working on the project, the shortcut key to save is just pressing Ctrl S. So just press Ctrl S to save the project as you're working on it. Now I want to give this leaf some thickness because right now it is super thin. So we're going to add the modifier which is called solidify to give it some thickness. So let's click on add modifier, and I just like to search for it because that's easier. So I'll just search for solidify and add the solidify modifier, and you can see now the solidify is right down here. And if I make this a bit bigger, I can change the thickness of that solidify. Now I actually want the solidify to come first before the subdivision surface, because when you are adding stacks of modifiers, the top modifier is going to be applied first, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So I want to first make it solid and then add the subsurf so that it'll smooth out those edges. So to bring the solidify above the subdivision surface, you can click on these little dots here, and then you can drag up and then let go. So this way now you can see the edges are quite smooth. And then let's also use the object context menu to shade the object smooth. And then also let's turn the thickness up just a little bit more so it's a little bit thicker, maybe even a little bit more, so something like that's pretty good. Now when we add this object to the geometry nodes to place it on a curve that we're going to be creating, wherever the origin point of the object is, that is where it's going to be instanced on the other object. And the origin point is going to be that little orange dot there, so when you select an object you'll see that little orange dot. So I want the leaf to come out of the curve right here on the end, so what I want to do is go into edit mode, and I just want to select everything with the A key, and I'll hit G to grab, and then I want to hit Y to bring the entire mesh over on the Y axis. We're going to stick it right about here. So this way, if I go back to object mode, the origin point is right here, and you can also see if I rotate the object, it rotates from the origin, so by hitting R to rotate, that'll rotate it around. So when we instance this object on a curve, when we instance it on the stem, it's going to come out from this part right here, which is the very end. And that's exactly what I want, so it'll look like it's coming out of the stem of the flower. So let's press Ctrl S again to save the project, and we can now add the curve object, which is going to be the flower stem. So if I press Shift A for the add menu, if you're newer to Blender, you may have not used these objects before, but they are curve objects. So the curve object is not a mesh. These are the mesh objects like the plane and the cube and the sphere, but a curve object is a little bit different. It's just going to give you curve data. So let's add the default one here, which is the Bezier. So when I add it, you can see it is just a little line here, and it is nice and smooth. So you can go into edit mode of the curves. You can see here we are in edit mode. However, when we go into edit mode, we can't actually edit the geometry. So there aren't vertices and edges and faces. There are instead these curve handles. So if you select the curve handle, you can hit G to grab, in R to rotate, and S to scale, and you can scale the curve handle. And you can see the curve object is going to rotate by the handle. And you can also select the end of the curve handles and kind of rotate this or kind of bring this in if you want to have it curve really sharply or curve much more smoothly. And then there's that on the other side as well. Now you can also hit the E key, and the E key is going to extrude out another curve handle. So now you can make the curve longer if you want. So I'm going to select everything with the A key, and I want to rotate this over just like that. And I'll rotate it over here and kind of stick it into the center of the scene. And then I want to straighten these out. So I'll select this one, kind of rotate it, select this handle, kind of rotate it. And this one here, maybe rotate that over and scale it down a little bit. So this is going to be the stem of the flower. So just kind of like that. So I'll hit the tab key to go back to object mode, and there is going to be our stem. And any time later in the video, you can always go back and edit the shape of it. So now I want to actually add geometry nodes to the curve. So as well as adding geometry nodes to a mesh object, you can also add them to a curve object. So select the curve, we can click on add modifier, and let's add geometry nodes. And then let's click on new to add new geometry node data. And I'm going to rename this to Geo-Nodes flower, but you can rename it to whatever you want. I'll rename it to Geo-Nodes flower. So now to actually edit the geometry, again, we need to click here to go to the Geometry Nodes workspace, or as I mentioned in part 1 of the tutorial series, you can click here in the corner when the crosshair appears, and you can click and drag out to split the window. And then if you click here to change the editor type, you can change this to the Geometry Nodes. But I'm going to click here and drag over and close that because I have the Geometry Nodes right over here. Let's make this smaller so we have a bit more space so you can see the actual mesh above me, and then we can work with the Geometry Nodes right here. All right, so the first thing thing that I want to do is actually give this curve some thickness, because right now if we tried to render this, you wouldn't be able to see the curve at all. It would be completely invisible because we're kind of just seeing like the wireframe of the curve, but it doesn't actually have any mesh thickness. So what we want to do is convert the curve to a mesh, and then we'll give it some thickness. So let's go to the add menu with Shift A, and we can start to type curve to mesh. We want to add the curve to mesh node. So we want to drop it here in between the input and the output, and that way we're taking the group input, which is this curve data, we're converting it to a mesh, and then we're outputting it onto the object. So it doesn't really look any different, and that is because we don't have any thickness. So we can use this profile curve here to actually give it thickness. So we can plug some other data up to the profile curve, and that'll tell it how thick it's going to be. So when I give it thickness, I want it to be circular. So we can actually add a circle, and then we can plug the circle into the profile curve to make the shape of the circle be the thickness. So let's press Shift A, and we're going to start to type in curve circle. So we're going to add the curve circle. Let's drop this down here. And before we continue, this would probably be a good place to talk about previewing different nodes and also the Node Wrangler add-on. So let's say that I want to just see what this curved circle looks like before I put it up into the profile curve. Well, what you could do is you could take the curve circle and you could just plug it directly up to this geometry. So this way you can now see what the curved circle actually looks like. You can see it is just a circle made up out of a curve. But what if I want to quickly be able to look at this and then switch back over here and looking at this without plugging up these values? Well, there is a really great built-in Blender add-on called the Node Wrangler. And to enable the Node Wrangler, you can click here on Edit, and then let's go to the preferences. So in Blender's user preferences, you can click over here on add-ons, and then over here on the search, you can type in node, and you can check mark the Node Wrangler add-on. And the Node Wrangler add-on will basically give you some tools and shortcut keys when you are using the nodes. So check mark the Node Wrangler, and then you can click on the Save Preferences button, or the Auto Save Preferences might already be on, so that the Node Wrangler is enabled in all of your future Blender projects. So I'll just close Blender's user preferences. So to use the Node Wrangler in the geometry nodes, you can hold down the Shift and Alt key, and then you can select different nodes. And you can see that it's going to change the output, and it's going to directly plug the output into whatever node you selected. So this way I can very quickly just hold down the Shift and Alt key and select many different nodes, and then I can actually preview what those nodes are looking like. So this is very, very useful. Now, just so that you're not confused, if you are in the shader editor also has nodes, but it's editing the actual material, not the geometry. If you are in the shader editor, you press the Control and Shift key instead. So you hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes to preview them. That is different from the geometry node editor. So in the geometry node editor, it is the Shift Alt key. So I just want to make sure you weren't confused by that, because when I was first learning geometry nodes, I was kind of confused. So in the geometry nodes, it's Shift Alt Select to preview the nodes, but in the shader editor, it's Shift Control Select to preview the different nodes. Now, right now, the resolution is actually pretty high, and we don't need the resolution to be that high. So if I Shift Alt and select the curve circle to preview it, I need to zoom in here because we made it really small. So let me just zoom way in so that you can see it. So now I can take the resolution and I can turn that down. So you can see if the resolution is set to 3, it's going to be like a triangle. And then as you turn it up, it's going to have more resolution. So I'm going to turn the resolution to 8 because that way it'll be kind of smooth, but we don't need a whole lot of resolution. So I can now Shift Alt and select the curve to mesh again, and that'll bring it back to the curve to mesh so that we can actually preview it. So let's press Ctrl S again to save, and I now want to add the leaf object onto the curve. So to do this, we need to add a new node, which is going to tell the leaf to be placed on the object. So I'll go to the add menu with Shift A, let's go to the search, and this is a very common node that you'll use with geometry nodes, and that is the instance on points node. So let's add the instance on points, and we can drop it here right after the curve to mesh. Now you can see that it's gotten rid of the geometry, so we can't see it, but we will fix that later. So the instance on points will basically just take the points of the mesh, and then it will put whatever object here is in the instance, and it will put it onto the mesh. So right now there is nothing there, and that's because we haven't given it the object data. So we need to add in the leaf object data into geometry nodes. So to do that, we can go to the add menu and let's go to the search. And there is actually a node for this, and that is the object info node. So the object info node is basically just going to give any object info or object data. Now, if we click here on the drop down, we need to tell it what object we want to use. So if we click here, you can see there is the plane, and this object here, if I select it, it is called plane. And actually, if you select this object, you can press F2 to rename it, and let's just call it leaf. So now if I click here again, you can see it's disappeared, but if I click here on the origin, I can see it now. So there is the geometry nodes, and you can see now here is the leaf. So because we want the leaf to be instanced on the curve, we want to take the geometry data and we will put that into the instance. And so now you can see that on all the points here, it is going to be placed onto the curve. Now there's a problem with this, and that is that there are way too many of them. So instead of them being instanced on all of the curve points, I want them to be randomly distributed on all of the faces of the curve. So there is a node for this. If you go to the add menu, go here to the search, you can search for the distribute points on faces. And this is also a very common node. Now you might think that you'd want to put this after the instance on points to actually affect the leaf, but we actually want to put it at the starting. So let's put the distribute points on faces before the instance on points. So this curve to mesh will go into the mesh, and then the distribute points on faces points will go into the points. So it's sort of like it's editing the points, the distribute points on faces. So the mesh data goes into the mesh, and then the distribute points on faces kind of randomly generates some different points of where the leaf is going to be. So then the points can go here into the points. And then this instance on points is actually going to tell this object to be instanced on the curve. So now you can see it is much more random, and this density value is going to make more points or less points, and they're going to be distributed on the curve. Now, you still can't actually see the curve. And so what we need to do is take this original curve to mesh, and we need to join it together. So basically, we want this data. If I Shift Alt select it, you can see there it is. And then this data, if I Control Shift and select on it, you can see I just want to join these two together. So there is actually a node to join different meshes together. So if I go to the add menu and go to the search, I can search for the join geometry node. And let's click on the join geometry and stick it here at the end of the instance on points. Now this join geometry, you can see it does have a circle here, but it is kind of long. So that's kind of telling us that we can plug up multiple meshes. So we can now take this curve to mesh. This is the original mesh. And again, if I Shift Alt select it, you can see that's what it looks like, and that's what we want. So let's Shift Alt select the join geometry. So I can now take the mesh and let's stick this here up to the geometry. So now you can see the leaves, but you can also see the stem. So if I click and drag to box select these nodes and hit G to grab to bring them down, these three nodes here, this is going to be the leaves being instanced, and then this here, this is going to be the original data, and then this is joining them together. Now later on in the video, when we create more and more geometry nodes, it might get a little bit complex, and so I want to keep my nodes very nicely organized so it's easy to understand. So what I can do is click and drag to box select these three nodes, and then I can press Control J. Control J is going to add this cool frame here. You can also press Shift A and you can search for frame, and you can add this dark frame here, and then you can drag nodes into the frame. I'm going to select this frame and press X to delete it. So because this is in a frame, it's kind of better organized, and I can also move the frame around. Now we can also add labels to the frame. So if you select the frame, you can press the F2 key. That is the shortcut key for adding a label, and you can call it leaves on stem. Or if you want to, you can press the N key to open up the side panel. And then if you click here on node, you can see there is a name here, and you can rename it whatever you want. I'll just use the shortcut keys because that's much faster. So I'll press N to close the side panel. So there is our leaves on stem. Now I want there to be more of an even distance in between all the leaves. But you can see right here, there's a really big gap, and here there's a big gap, but then right here there's a really small gap. So with the distribute points on faces node, we can click on random and we can change it to Poisson disk instead. And Poisson disk is going to give us a new value here, which is this distance min. And so if you turn this up, there's going to be more of a distance between each point. So I can turn the distance min very high, and this way there's going to be a large distance in between each leaf. So I'm going to turn the distance min to like a 0.2. That is pretty good for my leaf. So now you can see that there is going to be a minimum space value in between each one. And then here on the density max, I can turn this up even more if I want to. So on the density max, I'll turn this pretty high up to like a 300. And then also I think now the distance min, I will turn up a little bit more to like a 0.3. So there's a bit more space. All right, and then you can see the leaf is really big, but we'll fix that in a moment. And then of course the leaf is really big and the leaf is also all pointed in one direction, but we'll fix that in a moment. Now there's also this density factor, which I can turn down if I just want to like randomly get rid of more and more of the leaves. So now right over here on the instance on points, there is rotation values. So if I drag these values, it's going to rotate the instances. And then there is also the scale value here, so I can scale them on the X, Y, and Z axis. So I do want to rotate them around. I want to rotate them around on the Z-axis, but I want each one to be a random different rotation so that they are kind of randomly coming out of the stem. So to do that, we can add a node which is going to give the rotation all random values so that each leaf will have a random rotation. So if I go to the add menu and go here to the search, it is the random value node. So let's add the random value, and I can actually stick it here on the frame so that it's added into the frame, and let's actually drag it up here. So the random value node is going to generate random values between these two values. So right now on the default, the minimum is 0 and the maximum is 1. So then the random values would be like 0.1, 0.3, 0.8, and other random values in between the 0 and the 1. So what I can do is I can take the value and I will put that into the rotation to tell it to randomly generate values. And then here on the max value, I can turn this up more and you can see it's going to randomly be rotating them around. Now this is cool and it does look a bit better, but there is a problem with this, and that is that the rotation is all weird. This one is vertical and this one is horizontal, and the rotation is really messed up. So instead of plugging this up to the rotation to control the X, Y, and Z, I instead just want to control the Z, because I instead want them all to be rotated around, but only on the Z axis. So to do this, we can click on the float option here, and the float is going to be all three values, but I instead want to break up the values, so I'm going to change this to vector instead. So by changing it to vector, we now have 3 different values on the minimum and 3 values on the maximum. And so this will be the X, Y, and Z axis. So let's now take the value and we can put it into the rotation. And so now on the max values, let's turn these all to 0 so that the rotation is 0. But I can now just control the Y and the X and then also the Z. So this Z value here, I can turn this up to a really big number like 1000 so that it is random. Now for the X1 and the Y1, I do want to rotate them a little bit, but not very much. So I'm going to turn both of these to just like a 0.1. So now you can see there's slight variations in the X and the Y, but there's mainly just rotations in the Z. So we now also have these scale values here, and these are actually going to be the scale of the leaves. So I believe I mentioned this in part 1 of the tutorial series, but to scale all of the values at once, you can click on the top, and then you can drag down, and then you can drag back and forth, and that will scale all the values at once. So I'm going to turn these way down to maybe just like a 0.35, something like that is probably pretty good. So now you can see that all those leaves are randomly rotated around on the curve. Alright, so with that finished, this is going to wrap it up for part 2 of my Geometry Nodes for Beginners Blender tutorial series. So I hope you were able to easily understand everything that we did, and I hope you were easily able to follow along, and thank you so much for watching. And I'll be uploading one part each day of the tutorial series, so when part 3 is released, it'll be right up there on the end screen, and also the link in the video description. And if you're enjoying this tutorial series and you'd like to help support me and this channel, then a great way to do that is by checking out my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, where I have 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, and much more Blender content on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, so I'll have the links in the description. But I hope you enjoyed this, thank you for watching, and I will see you in part 3.